It's Saturday tea time in 1990 all over again. Well, it is if you've slipped into the alternate timeline where Doctor Who got one last chance at life and a set of 4 stories to make up season 27. In this episode of Doctor Who Lost and Found, we're off to meet a new companion, some new monsters, and a couple of slightly older looking friends. The show's facing the axe, and to save it, someone's going to have to take to the sword. But will this second story be a work of art, or will its plot be the crime of the century? A quick recap of the rules we're going to try to stick to. We'll allow some minor overrun in the episode lengths to compensate for the transfer to audio, but we'll be judging the stories rather than the acting, and trying to decide how well the BBC of 1990 could have handled the stories if the Big Finish scripts had been made for television rather than audio. Oh, and not only will there be necessary spoilers for Crime of the Century, but there will also be comments that need to be made about the next 2 tales as well. And that, by chance, relates to the first of the big questions that we can ask about this story. How much foreknowledge is the right amount for a 1990 Doctor Who season? Season 27, as discussed last time, has a very unusual feel for a Doctor Who season of the era. Prior to 27, there weren't really many seasons with a story or set of ideas running right through them. There's Season 16 with the Key to Time, but that just needed a very brief recap of some sort about the key at the start of each story, which otherwise was 6 self-contained stories. And there's Season 23, with 4 stories linked together to form the 5th big trial story. And I guess you could just about include Season 1, trying to get Ian and Barbara home. But this is the first season where there isn't an obvious story set up at the start. Each story takes elements from previous ones and then builds on them. So, in Crime of the Century, looking back, we have 2 characters reappearing from thin ice. A new character that was technically in thin ice as well, but we have a new alien race that will appear in the remaining 2 stories also. But do you admit that they'll be in the next 2 stories, or do you hold that back as a surprise? Certainly, a great deal of consideration has to be given to what they're going to need to do in all 3 stories for their design. Thankfully, when it comes to the Metatraxi, the actual dialogue is very vague about what they look like other than ugly, big ears, and insects with machine guns. These days, we could have insects of pretty much any look we wanted with CGI, but in my head I'm thinking that we'd end up with something like the Tritivores from Planet of the Dead, humanoid bodies with some sort of insect head. Plot-wise, it's something that we now recognise as pretty standard 7th Doctor fare from the Virgin New Adventures. The Doctor's already started a plan, we join in once it's underway, it then goes wrong at the last minute, and he's forced to improvise a new solution. In this case, the Doctor arranges for a cat burglar to steal a load of artefacts, including a sword with amazing or magic properties, so that one of the world's greatest swordsmen can take on a Metatraxi warrior in one-on-one combat in order to get them to destroy some robots before getting them off the Earth. Of course, we never actually get to find out how the Doctor knows all the Metatraxi stuff, but that's nothing compared to what we're not told about in the next 2 stories. We alternate between scenes in London with the Doctor and Rain, and scenes set in generic fictional foreign country with Ace. It's only in part 4 that we really get the TARDIS trio to be all together, and there's a lot of stuff at night and in cars and vehicles again. I'm not sure that it's supposed to be a running theme through the season, but out of the first 2 stories, there's probably a couple of episodes worth of footage that could be done either looking in through a windscreen or in through the back doors. Would this make for a particularly thrilling story? And more importantly, how is it going to translate to the screen? Let's start with the London-based bits. These take up a large chunk of Part 1 and the start of Part 2. There's the opening scene we've known about since the mid-1990s. New companion Rain cracks open a safe to find the Doctor inside before she promptly ditches him. Where things get a little bit more unusual is that Rain is going to write up the caper in her diary. We even hear her read bits out of it, which the Doctor will at some point end up reading, which is how he knows to go back and lock himself in the safe so that Rain will find him in there. Yes, technically that makes at least part of this story a bootstrap paradox. What's not clear is when the Doctor got hold of the diary or how he got hold of it, as this aspect of the plot is promptly dropped. It did feel as though this was going to be part of Rain's character, but I'm thinking that Big Finish might have felt this made her look too much like Benny. As we'll see in one of the other stories, there are some problematic aspects to this season 27 which definitely make it a 21st century production rather than an authentic one from 1990. Time travel shenanigans weren't a huge part of 20th century Doctor Who, and this certainly felt like something of a modern cheat to get the story moving along and into new territory. Bringing in a character's family was, however, something that season 27 was always planning on doing, and it's weird to think that family matters are now familiar territory for Who, as this would have been something more revolutionary in 1990. Rain, as it turns out, is the daughter of Marcus Creevey, with whom we spent 4 parts in Russia and 1960s London in the previous story. Naturally, they don't have a great relationship, but the Doctor helps put it right, and Rain gets recruited for his mission. Which basically means there's a lot of emotion done in night scenes in a dockyard somewhere. The cynic in me does wonder if by doing quite a lot of the scenes with Creevey at night, it might help the makeup department successfully age him 22 years, as we last saw him in 1967, and this story takes place in 1989. Which, I guess, technically makes the story a pseudo-historical. How they'd manage this with Felnikov, though, who also makes a comeback from the last story, is another matter, as a lot of his scenes are in the daylight. What is a nice touch, though, is that in 22 years Felnikov has gone from Major to Colonel, so, along with aging, he must have at least done something right. Part 2 is slightly too long, so I'm thinking that the sly comments about London Docklands getting developed wouldn't have been in a 1990s script, and that might even be enough to bring it down to the 24 or 25-minute window. Given how repetitive and dull the scenes with Ace and the Resistance fighters are, something needs to be done to make it feel the right length, as I think I aged about 22 years whilst listening to it. We're either in scene upon scene in off-road vehicles or in the mountains, which would probably have returned to Abominable Snowmen territory and been filmed in Snowdonia. There's even key scenes set inside a cave. Whether there's a palace in Snowdonia that could be used for part 2, or if that would have to be more glasswork is another matter, but inside the palace could be done pretty much anywhere or in studio. If studio work was needed for this second story, then it would possibly be down to the cliffhanger to part 2, which would probably be the traditional crash zoom onto a metatraxy. And this is where things get more interesting. The metatraxy are a big part of season 27, and have to be pretty nimble as they've got to get involved in gunfights, sword fights, and later on in the season, big arena scenes and, keeping things as spoiler-free as possible, hanging around scenes. They've got 2 fight scenes in part 3, a sword fight in part 4, and another big fight scene too. There's also supposed to be quite a lot of them as well, but with the amount they're used in the season, it's going to be money well spent. Unless 1990s BBC had weird things to say about spreading the cost across 3 stories, but we'll be generous this time and say that won't be a problem. Whilst I do like certain aspects of the characterization involving who they will and won't fight, there's a plot point about their translators that I really don't buy. It's bad enough that it's done as a joke for this story, and, well, let's just say that I'm not sure how it would go down with foreign audiences, but it becomes vital in other stories, and really doesn't make any sense to me at all. The idea that aliens would find specific dialects and accents from Earth embarrassing, well, it feels damn snobbish, and I'm just not sure it adds to the season when it becomes a plot point. I actually felt quite embarrassed that Big Finish felt it appropriate. And then there's part 4, and this is where things get just a little bit stretched for 90s budgets and time slots. We've gone from 3 episodes that only need minor trims to an episode that's probably about 10 minutes too long. There's a redressed location from part 1, and we have 2 new locations that would need sorting out. We also get the big showdown between Metatraxi and, wait for it, an army of killer robots. Now, I'm not suggesting that this battle would have been done with a lot of reaction shots, off-screen light effects, and smoke and mirrors, but I do suspect that doing it justice would have been a little beyond the scope of Doctor Who in the 1990s. It's either that, or they would have gone all out on it, and, well, I'll leave it up to you to decide just how well it would have gone. They would at least have needed to make up one robot that looked good on screen, though, for the scenes in the vault, unless they shot the scenes from the robot's point of view, as they did for the opening bits in Tom Baker's Robot. I know these days we're all mad for CGI. Well, that's seemingly what the people who make TV shows think. But I want to believe that this season 27 would show that creativity and direction was just as effective as impressive effects. Sadly, the plot once again didn't really do much for me, and either needed something meatier added, or things moved along much quicker. What's very telling is that the scenes in parts 1 and 2, with Ace and the fighters, were coincidentally reminiscent of Ace and weapon suppliers in the Virgin New Adventure Warhead, which does make me wonder how much of this would be a real 1990 TV story, and how much is recycling of a later 1990s novel. But, as the Doctor and Ace walk off arm in arm into the distance, this time along with Rain, we head towards the 3rd story of the season. We can mostly leave car and vans behind us, say hello to more old friends, and really give the effects team something to get their teeth into. After 2 stories of very heavy talk, Story 3 is going to be a very different beast indeed.